Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are chugging along on the Oiran build for Komuraski with our second garment for the whole set, which is what I am calling a Donuki. We didn't really decide what this was if you watched the video I made about all of the different parts and what they're called, but I'm going to be calling it a Donuki just because that's easy for me to say and to keep moving forward with that idea. So this is going to be hopefully a pretty easy build. It's going to consist of a main kimono piece with a haneri collar over it, which is going to have a collar stiffener put in it. As we move out from the inside of the garment, finishing techniques have to get a little bit more precise and a little bit more clean as they become more visible. So this is going to have a little bit more precise finishing. The sleeves are going to be lined and the hem of the garment will be showing, so we'll have to take some extra care to make sure that looks good. With that being said, let's go. To start this project, I'm using a Chiriman crepe and cutting large panels out of the fabric based off of the patterns by Billy Matsunaga. I highly recommend doing this with a buddy or a friend or a sibling if you can get someone to help you with it. These pieces of fabric are really long and can be really hard to manage on your own, so having a buddy there to back you up and hold your rulers and measuring tape straight really makes a difference. Shout out to Sean for helping me in this video. Okay, so I have just finished cutting out all of the fabric for my second layer of the kimono, which I'm calling my Donuki layer, whether that's correct or not, that's what I'm going with. And that is a lovely silk crepe. I bought it online. I'm hoping it's actually what it says it is, but also I have no way of verifying. But it's supposed to be what's called a Chiriman crepe, which is a very traditional style of silk crepe used for kimono. It won't be visible in a lot of places, but I bought this many moons ago for this project with the intent to originally dye it, and then realized that silk is apparently really hard to dye if you aren't doing it at an early stage of the process, so I decided to nix that and use it for this layer instead and use a cotton, which is much more dye friendly later. So what I'm going to do next is I'm taking a little bit of a break from sewing just to keep things fresh and different, because it's basically just cutting out the same pieces over and over again, and I am going to go dye some fabric. This is a very beautiful, it's called, it's off fabric.com, I think it's called like Telio sand washed something. It's a mixture of cotton and something called tinsel and another thing. It's very sciencey sounding, but it's got this really beautiful sort of glossy shine to it that isn't like satin. It's very unique, and I think it's really beautiful, but it's also stupid expensive, so I bought like a yard or two of it at the beginning when I was impulse buying fabrics for this project, and then realized that I don't have the money to buy a bunch of that for this project. So it is going to instead get used for the date-eri, which is going to go inside the outer kimono, and then also for like sleeve linings and stuff. I plan on lining the sleeves for the hikizuri kimono and potentially the Donuki layer, depending on how I feel. So I am... Oh, and then also the uchikake. So it'll probably be sleeve linings for the uchikake and the hikizuri kimono. And both of those have either pinkish tones or will go well with pink, so I'm just going to batch dye the whole thing pink. Which is why I've got this little strip in my hand. This is going to get cut up into pieces and then tested in the dye before I submerge the whole thing to make sure it actually is, you know, gonna work. So we are going to go do that now. You're going to come to my very messy kitchen. Let's go. To dye fabric, you'll need a couple things. One, a large stirring implement for your fabrics. I recommend a wooden dowel because it keeps all of your food items safe. You really don't want to mix things that you're using to cook food with things that you use in your dye baths because the dye can be very toxic. Additionally, you'll want a large pot. The bigger the better, honestly, unless you're dyeing very small items. You want something where the fabric can flow freely and there will be enough headroom at the top that the water won't overflow when it starts to bubble. For this project, I'm using RIT Dye-More, which is a type of dye meant to be used on polyester and other synthetic fabrics. Synthetics don't take dye the same way natural fibers like linen and cotton do, because they're basically made of plastic. You need special dyes that are meant to adhere to those polyester plastic fibers instead. This fabric is not polyester, but I also am not quite sure what some of its content is. It's listed as Tencel and a couple other things, and I'm not sure how synthetic those materials are, so I'm hedging my bets. You can dye cottons and linens in Dye-More, you cannot dye synthetics in regular RIT. The process that you see me doing here is a couple strips of fabric with a timer to see how long I want these pieces to sit in the dye for. I take them out in increments, and I can test to see if I like that color and if I want to reduce or add more. Here, I'm iffy on it. It's a okay color, but I try again and see if I like a different color batch better, and I liked it, so I moved forward with adding all of the fabric to the dye instead. My only bit of advice during this is stir constantly, but be careful. The next steps in the process are basically just sewing up the sleeves, prepping the collar, getting all of the pieces assembled before any linings or finishings can take place. That is my boyfriend bringing me sugar cubes like I am a horse. Thanks, Sean. Back to sewing. This was a really weird fabric to work with. I've never worked with shearmen before, so I don't know if it's just this one, but it felt very spongy at times. But I don't know if that's just me. Either way, this is basically just sewing long, straight stitches down huge pieces of fabric. So buckle down, have a good time, sew some straight lines. Okay, so I have hit a snag with the Donuki layer. It's too short. It would be almost the perfect length if I was making it for a regular kimono, but since all the images of it have it draping the ground, it is considerably too short. It sits at about ankle level. So I have been racking my brain trying to figure out what to do about that, and I think what I've decided is that I'm going to split the kimono along the shoulder seams and add a little bit more length in there, which is going to mess with things a little bit, but I can't figure out what else to do. My other option is that there's usually a line where it's designed to take up kimono to make them shorter, like this, and I could cut along that line and insert a panel of fabric there on the front and back. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet, but both of those inserts should be mostly invisible, since you won't see it, which I think I'll prefer over putting something on the hem, since that would be much more visible from the outside of the garment. So I'm gonna do some thinking, some planning, and I'll figure out what we're doing after that. Having said all of that, I move forward with my harebrained scheme of inserting a panel at the shoulders for the kimono. In hindsight, this was a bad idea. I don't recommend doing this. It did not work, which you'll see in a minute, and I wasted a lot of time doing it. It would have probably been better to just cut my losses. But I went forward with it with the best of intentions, and you might have been able to make it work if you personally were using a more stable fabric than I was, but the combination of this being so stretchy and then also a mess just really did not work out, and it ended up looking very messy. To distract myself from that total abomination, I decided to work on my sleeve panels. So this is me figuring out how to do the linings. in my very cozy robe. Don't make fun of me, I like to be cozy and my house gets kind of cold. But basically I just lined up the exterior panels to the gold fabric I wanted to use for the inside and just cut along those lines. You have to do kind of a little song and dance to get the lining to match up with the outer sleeve. Basically, you have to sew up both sleeves independently of each other to make them tubes, and then you have to put one inside of the other, right sides facing, and sew up along one side of it around the hand closure, and then where it closes down the side and bottom, and leaving the side that touches the body open, because that will be sewn separately and you'll need to be able to fold the two pieces in towards each other in order to cover the raw seams. If that seems really complicated, I would recommend finding someone else's video on how to do this kind of thing, because I am not very good at it and I'm not going to give you good information. Anyways, after that, basically you just fold back the seam edges of the body where the sleeves go, mark where the opening's gonna end, and then iron and sew that down. After that, you make up the collar, which is just a couple rectangles with some shaping around the neckline, and sew it all down. And after all of that was done, it was time to try it on. Unfortunately, I hated it. It did not fit well at all. You'll see it in the video here, but the sleeves just do not sit where they're supposed to. The shoulders are way too long. I even took a tuck out of them and they still do not look right. I realize now that my hand was in the wrong hole on the right hand side sleeve there, but regardless, it still did not fit well. You can see how far out the undersleeves are peeking out through the oversleeve. That is not how those are supposed to look. The whole thing is just a mess. After that, it was back to the drawing board. I removed the sleeves from the garment so I could save those for later, since as far as I could tell, they were pretty much fine, and then took apart the garment itself. I ended up splitting the top and bottom into two pieces so that I could make a skirt out of the majority of the kimono. Essentially, I'm making the same format of garments as my undergarments with a susuyoke and a hanjuban as in my last video. Since there was a little bit of collar left at the top of the skirt from where I had cut it, I ended up folding this back and sewing it down along the edge just to get it to sit flatly and a little bit more cleanly. This does kind of expose the seam on the underside, but it's not visible when worn with the layers over it, so I wasn't really worried about it. This was then finished off with a large waistband in a very similar style to the one I did on my susuyoke. And it was time to move on to the replacement for the top of the kimono, the hanjuban. This was basically made out of a cotton sateen and replaced the body part of the top of the garment. I didn't want to redo the crepe again since it hadn't worked out the first time, so I picked a much stiffer, stronger, non-stretchy fabric instead. Everything was then assembled exactly the same way the last one was, in the same exact process. The funny thing about kimono is that once you do one, you've kind of sewn all of them. So at this point, I kind of feel like I can make kimono in my sleep. The last step was to add some embroidery on the haneri, which is a collar covering. This one is made out of a white silk taffeta, and I traced on small flowers in graphite onto it, and then embroidered these with a silken embroidery floss. Okay, so final thoughts on the second layer, the Donuki layer of the kimono. I am actually really happy with how this came out. I'm a little bit bummed about where the folds on the susuyoke, the skirt portion, fold over and look. That's a design flaw, unfortunately, of the original kimono that I was making. And without remaking the bottom piece entirely, there's not really a whole lot I could do about it. So I'm, making the best of it. But other than that, I'm super happy. I'm really glad I remade this top part. It fits so much better than it did before. It sits much cleaner, it looks a lot nicer, and I'm much happier with it. Additionally, the collar, the embroidery was a little bit of a silly side thing that I wanted to do, but I am also really glad that I did it. I think it looks really nice, even if it is kind of in odd places because I didn't measure it beforehand. But parting thoughts on this, if you are making something like this, double check that your crepe doesn't have any stretch, and most likely it will have stretch, so if it does, try and account for that when you're making your garments, since they have to kind of fit on top of each other. Don't be afraid to use cotton for inner layers for things. It is sturdy, it is reliable, it is easy to use, and I'm glad that I used it for the remake for this top part. And honestly, just, you know, don't be afraid to remake things. I'm really happy that I did with this, and it looks a lot better now. So, on to the next part of this build. I think next is the Hikizuri kimono, which is going to be the large kimono with the trailing train. It's going to have some goldwork embroidery, it's going to have some HT vinyl, it's going to have an entirely messed up process that I had to cut and start over the project with. So that's all going to be coming up in the next video. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!